Welcome to the new episode of our podcast On the Spot. Today's topics are the elections taking place in the Republic of Georgia on Sunday. So we will discuss the importance of the elections, what's at stake, and discuss both internal and geopolitical consequences of these elections with Mr. Irakli Porchkhidze, the Senior Vice President and co-founder of the Georgian Institute for Security Studies. But Mr. Porchkhidze has a really rich experience, both academic. He was the dean of the State University School of Law. He also had held very important positions in public administration. He was a deputy minister for integration and also deputy national security advisor to Georgian President Saakashvili. So, Mr. Porchkhidze, thank you so much for kindly accepting my invitation.
It's my pleasure, and I'll be very happy to talk about the topic that you have named, and I would like to greet all your viewers and listeners.
Thank you. So let's start with the electoral conditions and also with the nature of the regime and the system of government of the Georgian Dream and their evolutions since they've been in power since 2012, that is similar to the Serbian Progressive Party in Serbia. And we know that just a few months ago that this law on foreign agents or foreign influence has been adopted in Georgia, shrinking the space for civil society. But there are, I'm sure, much more instruments than this one.
Yes, I mean, as you have mentioned, on 26th of October, we are going to have crucial parliamentary elections, and these elections are going to be basically between the challenge is going to be between the party in power, which is the Georgian Dream, which has been lately openly pro-Russian, and the opposition. And the opposition, we have four major players right now: the former party of President Saakashvili, UNM. There is also the second party, which is the Achali, known as New. So that's the name of the party. You also have Party Lelo, and you have the former GD, or the Georgian Dream Prime Minister's party, Gahari's party, which is also part of the opposition right now. And most of them right now are branded as the pro-Western opposition. So right now what is happening is that the parliament, it's going to be for the first time in Georgian history that, in late history, that the parliamentary elections will take place according to the so-called proportional lists.
Okay.
So the party lists. So it's also extremely important to see how that will go. But just to explain the evolution of the Georgian Dream from the party, which was regarded as the party also linked with the pro-Western aspirations of Georgia, starting from 2012, when they assumed the so-called the power here in Georgia. Ever since, of course, what we have been seeing is the gradual decline of the pro-Western sentiments inside the party, and of course the way they have been behaving. What we see is that lately, starting from 2022, especially, they became overtly anti-West. And in the rhetoric, they have been most of the times bashing the Western allies of Georgia for a considerable time. Starting from that period, of course, they started to be extremely repressive when it comes to the civil society, also the opposition in general. But just to kind of make it very clear and put it in a kind of resume, they have been going against any dissenting opinion or any free space in the public space. And that was a clear sign that the government would be going towards the elections in an uneven and unbalanced, let's say, process that we have right now, electoral process that we have right now in Georgia. Well, the problem is, of course, that Georgia has been a staunch proponent of the, let's say, support coming from the West, and that has been something that has been the sentiment of the public for almost the last 20 years. So Georgian public has shown a support for the pro-Western sentiments, and the government, what it does is that it uses a lot of tools to basically derail Georgia on its path. So nowadays, what we have in Georgia is basically a referendum. Where will Georgia be? Is it going to be Georgia, which is going to be sovereign, independent, and looking towards the partners which are trying to support its sovereignty and territorial integrity? And the West has been always doing that. Or it's going to be going towards Russia, because Russia has been also an occupying force. It occupies 20% of Georgian territory. It constantly goes against the statehood of Georgia. It tries to create the so-called conditions which will limit Georgia's sovereignty. So it is a referendum where Georgia will be going towards the free world, or it's going to be subjugated and going towards the Russian sphere of influence.
So,
and that in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the change of the electoral system. Was it done to the adventures of the Georgian Dream? Are there closed lists? Is the whole Georgia one electoral unit, or you have several electoral units and some gerrymandering has been done?
Well, basically, this system has been demanded for a very long time, and in the end they had to give up because there were protests, and there were huge protests, and a lot of people came out. The Georgian public still shows the willingness to change things. So the government which is in place had to give in, and before that, we used to have the so-called mixed system where you had a proportional list or the party lists. Plus, we used to have the so-called majoritarian single district districts where you will electing particular personalities. The candidates coming also from the parties. Most of them. There were some independents, but it was a mixed system, and it was giving a huge preponderance to the party in power. But nowadays it's going to be contested in a new system, and let's hope that the national vote is going to be anti-government. But of course, there are a lot of problems related to the free expression of the will, and it's not only about the way they were redrawing the borders of the electoral districts, etc. I mean, it hasn't been that big of a problem. I think that the biggest problem is coming from the uneven playing field for all the players. And that's the biggest challenge right now, because the government is the most resourced player right now. So they have the financial resources, of course. They have the state budget. They're using it, of course, for their own interests. They also have huge preponderance when it comes to so-called administrative resource. They're a repressive government, meaning that they have the so-called state security service, which is basically a political arm of the ruling party, which is headed by the oligarch, the Russia-made oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili, who actually hangs as a shadow over the government, who is the person who is responsible for coming up with the regime and the system that we have.
There is a formal center of power.
Yes, exactly. So he's the one who is basically pulling all the strings. He's the one who is making the appointments. He basically is the guy who is responsible for the state capture that we have. But just go back to the uneven playing field. Of course, as I said, it's also about repression. It's about the finances, about administrative resources. So what I mean by the repression, of course, that can be a coercion. I mean, physical coercion, sometimes beat-ups, and physical retaliation against the opponents. These opponents are any person or any actor which is having a dissenting opinion. Just being in opposition or just being in a civil society might get you in trouble. It's also about cooptation. Sometimes they co-opt people, and then repress them, saying that, if you don't do it, we are going to fire your relatives. Or sometimes it's just if you have a business, you will have financial police coming to your home or coming to your business and basically taking it away or fining you with huge sanctions, the fines. So these are all kind of repressive methods they use. They also use the so-called, as we call it, informal influence networks, and it's organized crime, of course, and the organized crime is involved there as well. And most of the times they use that for some wrongdoings that they don't want to be directly affiliated with. So they will have the so-called proxies, and oftentimes, of course, they serve their interests. And that has been a clear sign that the government has been in cahoots with organized crime groups for a very long time. This is not only for these elections, but before as well. Well, the other tactic that they have been using is linked with the media, because they have a lot of state-run media. They have been investing hugely into setting up the media. Here we talk about the TVs. Here we talk about the social social networks and the accounts, the troll accounts, let it be, or also creating the so-called cobweb of supportive media outlets, the ones which we call them the press agencies, the ones that disseminate information. They also create the so-called front organizations for running different types of websites, the smear campaigns that they use. They are basically on a full-scale information warfare operation. And that basically has anything to do with any type of propaganda that might be right now circulating in Western Balkans as well, because the narratives that they are spewing and the narratives that they are generating are very much similar. I've been reading some of that from your part of the world, but also in the other areas, the Eastern Partnership areas where we come from, and from the from Georgia as well. So that anti-Western and I would say definitely an aligned messaging with the Kremlin is also present here. So they are brainwashing people to a huge level and degree. And that's a huge problem, of course. Also, they have different types of electoral schemes. I'm pretty sure that you might be aware, but these schemes are there in order to create basically the rigging prerequisites for the elections which are going to be taking place. So what they do is that they're trying to remove the ID cards from the ones who are supporters of different opposition organizations. So they will basically take away the ID cards. Some of them, they also have access to the electoral lists and also personal information of a lot of people. So they use it for their own benefit. They're trying to come up, they're basically going against the so-called secrecy of the ballot. So they are trying to expose people, who they are voting for, and then just do anything they want with that, trying to scare them, try to co-opt them. And as I said, sometimes to take away the ID cards. Of course, they also do the vote buying. And the vote buying is a serious problem. They also do the so-called stuffing of the electoral commissions at the local level. And most of these people, they have to be selected according to a so-called non-partisan criteria. They have to be non-partisan, they have to be capable and qualified. But unfortunately, of course, in most of the places, these are the people who are open supporters of the party in power. So the electoral commissions are stuffed not in the way that it would represent the fair representation of the.
So they have majority in all these commissions.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, on paper they would say that, oh no, these are the people who are not party affiliated, but everyone knows that they are actually supporters. Some of them will be the teens of people who are at the local government. Some of them will be actually the family members, friends, and just part of the network that these people come from. Also, the central election. Yes, and also election commission. The Central Election Commission. There is no trust in the Central Election Commission, unfortunately, and the head of the election commission himself is not highly regarded. That's kind of the fact of life right now in Georgia. So even though it's kind of a break or make point for Georgia, and it's extremely important historic moment for Georgian democracy, where it's going to be going. Is it going to be more repressive and it's going to be even more authoritarian right now, or it's going to be about kind of the Georgia going towards consolidated democracy and evolutionary path towards democracy. So there are many things at stake. So it's not only about Georgia being independent and not independent. It's not only about being pro-Russian or pro-Western or pro-free world. It's also about, are you going to be democratic, or are you going to be more and more authoritarian? So we have a lot of these dichotomies, and a lot of things play out here in Georgia as well. So it's not only in other parts of the world or in our region. For example, we have the war which is going on now in Ukraine, and where basically you have the same challenge, between the repressive and oppressive neighbor who is trying to be, subsumed by this imperial cravings and this imperial project, and you also have an independent state which is trying to defend itself. It's also about democracy that you have in Ukraine, and you also have this repressive, authoritarian, almost dictatorial state, in the face of Russia. So we have a lot of these dichotomies. So some are fighting the wars which are hot wars, and some are fighting the wars which are cold at the moment, but they also represent the same type of challenge that is right now present globally. So a lot of things are at stake.
Yeah, and even I think the Georgian Dream threatened that if they win, they would ban the opposition political parties. But how the opposition parties and these coalitions react to these unfair conditions on the one hand, so how they mobilize public opinion. And there was a huge rally last Sunday, I think, in pro-EU in Tbilisi. And on the other hand, how does the EU react to these undemocratic practices after granting Georgia EU candidate status last year, and how it affects the public opinion?
Yes, as you rightly mentioned, Georgia was granted the candidate status. Together with, they got it previously. Moldova and Ukraine, and Georgia also got it a bit later on, but we still did. Nowadays, our path towards the integration towards the EU is unfortunately frozen, because the EU made it very clear that if the government will continue to be doing what they are doing, and with all the repressive mechanisms in place, and you named this law, which is basically a law à la Putin, the so-called foreign influence law, which is very much what Russia has been doing has done starting from 2012. And also some other countries followed the suit, as you know. So Georgia has also done that. So basically, this is a tool which is directed against anyone who is holding a different opinion from the government. So EU made it very clear that if you continue to do this kind of thing, being restrictive towards the free spaces that you have in your country, if you're not going to be following the values and the rules which are there, of course, any talk about the advancement on the path is not there. So that was the reaction. And Georgia, Ukraine and Moldova, they have started the negotiations, so they have opened the chapters. But when it comes to Georgia, we are in the we are basically waiting in the corridor right now. We are not allowed to start basically this talk. So that has been kind of the biggest reaction. There has been also messages coming from the United States and also the EU that if it's going to be continuing, there are going to be some other measures put in place. So what measures? So those measures can be, and which are already there, which is kind of stopping any financial support going to the government. So they have diverted these funds and said that we are not going to be continuing to do that. It's also going to be about some restrictive measures which might follow towards the perpetrators of the violations of human rights. So it can be sanctions, and there are different types of sanctions. The sanctions which are related to the imposition of the so-called visa bans, or it can also be financial restrictions, which basically will mean that all the assets that the people who are responsible for these repressive measures are going to be imposed upon, which is the freezing of bank accounts or any transactions or any assets, real estate, let it be, or movable and other types of immovable property in those jurisdictions where these sanctions are going to be. So we basically have that reaction, which is coming from the West, and also basically freezing all types of deepening cooperation dynamic, which was there. And of course, there is an internal dynamic, and your question was referring to our opposition. And the opposition is trying to mobilize people and their supporters. They're trying to have the campaigns, of course, with the limited resources that they have. They don't have the same type of the equal access to many of the buildings and also the spaces that they need. Sometimes the supporters are beaten, but in spite of that, they're trying to have campaigns. And what is good is that people are showing willingness to come out. As you rightly mentioned, this Sunday we had the so-called pro-democracy protests, which took place in Tbilisi. Approximately 100,000 people came out to the streets. Basically, it was a kind of a expression of a very concrete support for the upcoming elections and for the turn towards the free world, and the support for opposition, because that was actually a sign that people want to come out to the streets and show their support for the change that they think should come.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the reaction of the EU and the United States or the Western allies, but what is the position of Russia, especially, and also I assume that faced with such potential, let's say, sanctions from the West, the regime is trying to find some other sources of investment, maybe from China. And especially is interesting Russia's position because they have this, let's say, trump cards and bargaining chips by maybe hinting that if Georgia abandons its Western aspirations, that maybe the breakaway promises of Abkhazia and Southeast Asia, where Russia has strong influence in, could be returned under Tbilisi's control.
Well, that idea was trying to be exploited by the ruling party here in Georgia, and they have voiced it a few times, but Russia was adamant to accept it. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that Russia is going to be giving up anything. That's a delusional and mythological dilemma. The ruling party here, the Georgian Dream, is playing with that idea, and they're trying to kind of create this propaganda that, if we are going to be winning, there is a chance that, we will be having the territorial integrity restored. But from Russians, at the level of their political actors, also at the level of the speakers that they have, let it be at the level of the MFA or elsewhere, they were adamant to accept it. Actually, they were going against it. They were saying that, that's a fait accompli. That's a fait accompli. It's not going to change. What we can help you with is to kind of create good and neighborly relations with the occupied territories, basically recognizing the status quo created coercively by Russia. So, but when it comes to the Russian attitudes in general, of course, they're happy with what is happening here in Georgia, because Georgia has turned away from the West, and showing a cold shoulder for quite some time. They're happy that the Georgian government is basically following this suit when it comes to the messaging and the disinformation, the anti-Western and disinformation that Russia has been spewing. And they're also happy that Georgia has basically stopped the integration processes, both towards the EU as well as NATO. So they are very happy with the regime here on the ground, and they're doing everything for them to stay in power. What are they doing? For example, they have opened they have restarted the visa-free regime for some categories of Georgians. So basically, they want them to be closer. It's unfortunate, but up to 2012, Georgia has become even more dependent on the exports towards Russia. So we have the diversified economic profile when it came to trade. But nowadays, we are extremely dependent on the Russian markets. There are some sectors that are almost 100% dependent. Not 100, but 90, 80%. For example, such as wine exports. So, but also the imports. We are right now importing almost 100% of wheat products from Moscow and from Russia. So we are actually getting dependent on the Russian imports. And it's not only about the wheat, but also some other category of commodities. So we have to understand that Russia has been growing its influence on Georgia economically. It has opened the so-called the visa-free travel. It has restored the so-called direct flights to Georgia, which has not been the case, and now they have started it once again. It's also about as I said, this the Russians. There are a lot of Russians right now present in Georgia. Some of them have fled the so-called conscription and mobilization, which is taking place in Moscow, has taken place, and they have moved. Some others are just staying away from Russia because they don't want to be under sanctions. So you have a lot of this kind of the influx of Russians, which creates a huge demographic change when it comes to where Georgia might be heading. It also has affected Georgia because the inflation has skyrocketed. So they are bringing money, which is a kind of a one-time effect on Georgian economy. But what has happened is that, yes, economy has been growing because of this, not only of this, and I can explain of what other things have been happening because of the policy towards Russia. But what it does is that the prices have gone up. So for ordinary Georgians now, there are huge problems related to that. I know that in Serbia, you have the same effect. What I know is that you have 300,000 Russians being there. It creates this kind of one-time economic effect, but then it also distorts the economic picture, in the mid to long term. Also, Georgia has been implicated by many internally, but also externally in supporting Russia to avoid sanctions. So a lot of goods are going through Georgia towards other countries, which are also part of the so-called customs union, which is under the Moscow's iron fist. And then they are and then once it enters this customs union, basically Russia can take all the goods that they want from those areas. So Georgia is implicating in that as well. So this whole idea of the sanctions regime being challenged by the third parties, unfortunately, has also Georgia as one of those countries that might be helping the Kremlin. So you create this dependency on Russia, and the Georgian government has been very much willing to do so. So Moscow and the Kremlin is extremely happy with that development and with the government here. And of course, they will be supporting them. They also don't create any sabotage campaigns that they used to do with the previous government, doing the land grabs or also coming up with different types of provocations, sometimes armed, sometimes with explosives, on our electric grid, etc. So they were doing all types of malign influence operations, the so-called active measures, as they call it. So they have been giving a huge boost to the regime by not doing the same thing and undermining the regime. So we have to understand that all of this is coming into the picture as Russia being happy with the government which is present here.
And by way of concluding, if what the polls are saying, and what if the opposition in some wins the elections, is the peaceful transition of power expected, and how would the opposition react otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, well, what the polls are showing, of course, the government has its own polls, and it's showing very unreal numbers, that they're winning with above 60%, which makes no sense. Because if you go around Georgia right now, you will see that that's not the national mood. Most of the polls are showing that if the government will allow to be having a contested, to have a contest which is not going to be rigged, the national mood is that the change is coming. So most of the polls are showing that the coalition will be held if the four actors right now, the opposition actors, will go beyond the 5% threshold. And actually, some of the, and if you combine all the polling, you will see that the opposition can garner more than 50% of the votes. So the coalition government is more than possible if the national will and the free will of the people are reflected. Of course, we will see how big of the rigging and the fraud will be during the election day. Actually, one more point I wanted to make. Also, the government is limiting our emigres communities to vote. So people who emigrated to different parts of the world, they're limiting their opportunities to vote. How? they don't open the precincts at the places where there is a huge accumulation of Georgians. Also, they create different types of hurdles. Some of them are removing them from the so-called consulate lists registration, so they're not active voters. And then our community has to fight to go back on the list, etc. So they're doing all of that coming together. When it comes to the election day itself, and if there is a rigging, what I understand is, of course, that it's going to be extremely important for international community not to recognize elections and not to legitimize elections if the fraud and if the rigging is taking place to the degree that the vote was not reflective of the will of the people. Well, what will happen then? Well, I don't know exactly what will happen, but most likely, like it has been previously, the people will come out to the streets. And it is likely that the people will come out to the street to defend their votes. And let's see what will happen. I hope that it will not be necessary, of course, but usually that's what happens when the election results are not reflected. And that's not the best scenario, because we want the elections to be held in a proper way without any challenge to the expression of the free will. But let's see how things will go. It will also depend on the observers, international observers at the precinct levels, how the ballots are counted and how the complaints are filed. So it has to be, I mean, the party representatives, who are there should be doing their work. The international observers should be doing their work. Local observers should be doing their work of documenting the fraud and rigging if it takes place. I mean, all types of wrongdoing, but also to be very clear that if something like this happens, it's not going to be tolerated by the international community. Sending a very clear message is important. And let's hope that that won't be necessary, but if it happens, international community should be very clear with a very clear messaging sent to the authorities.
I think it's a perfect way to end this conversation. I also hope that the democracy will prevail and that this is the path that Georgia would take, this democratic transition, and that the free will of the people would be reflected into in the election results. So good luck on Sunday, and we are looking forward to hearing good news from the Bundestag.
Thanks a lot for the interest in Georgian elections and the fate of Georgia. It's greatly appreciated, and I wish Serbia luck, on its path towards a democratic country and society.
Thank you so much. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you. All the best. Bye.
Bye.